The wind had teeth in the high country. It tore at the thin wool of her shawl, a ragged thing that offered more memory than warmth. Theda stumbled, one foot catching on a root hidden beneath the pine needles, and her body pitched forward. She twisted, a desperate animal instinct, to shield the bundle clutched to her chest. Her hip struck a rock, a sharp, grinding pain that stole her breath, but the baby only let out a startled whimper, his small face still burrowed into the hollow of her neck. She lay there for a moment, the cold of the earth seeping through her worn dress, tasting blood on her lip. She had been walking for 3 days, or maybe 4. The sun rose and set. The world turned, and all she knew was the ache in her feet and the gnawing emptiness in her belly. She had followed the creek because the man at the last settlement, a place she couldn't even name, had spat tobacco juice and said the creek ran down from the Ghostwood Mountains. "Ain't nothing up there but spirits and Silas," he'd grumbled. "And Silas ain't spoke a word in 10 years. Best leave 'em both be." That was all she needed to hear. A place where no one went. A man who wouldn't ask questions because he couldn't. It sounded less like a wilderness and more like a sanctuary. But the man hadn't mentioned the teeth in the wind, or the way the trees grew so thick they swallowed the light, or how a woman's hope could wear down to a raw nub, just like the soles of her shoes. The baby, Leo, stirred against her, his small body a furnace of warmth that was the only thing keeping the chill from her bones. He was all she had left of the life before the running, before she had shed her name like a snake sheds its skin, hoping to leave the poison behind. She pushed herself up, her hips screaming in protest. Every muscle trembled with exhaustion. She looked at Leo's face, pale and still in the dappled, failing light. His lips were dry. He hadn't nursed properly in a day. The fear that had been her constant companion coiled tighter in her gut. She had to find shelter. Now. That was when she saw it. Not a structure, not a cabin, but a faint gray plume rising against the deep green of the pines. Smoke. It was thin, almost invisible, but it was there. It was a sign of life in a place that was supposed to be dead. Hope, sharp and painful, pierced through her exhaustion. She didn't care if it was spirits or Silas. A fire meant warmth. A roof meant a reprieve from the wind. She adjusted the sleeping baby in her arms and began to walk again, her steps clumsy but certain, aimed for that fragile thread of smoke. The cabin was small, brutal in its simplicity. Hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, sat under a roof of rough-hewn shakes. An axe was buried in a chopping block near the door, its handle worn smooth with use. There were no windows on the side facing her, only a single dark square on the front. It looked less like a home and more like a fortress, a place built to keep the world out. She hesitated at the edge of the clearing, the smell of wood smoke and something savory, maybe roasting meat, making her stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it was nauseating. What if the man was dangerous? What if he turned her away? But then Leo coughed, a dry, rattling sound that shook his tiny frame, and her choice was gone. Danger ahead was better than certain death behind. She took a step, then another, her legs feeling like water. She reached the door, a heavy plank of wood with a leather latch. She raised a hand to knock, but the strength fled from her. Her vision swam, the edges turning dark and fuzzy. The world tilted on its axis. The last thing she felt was the rough scrape of the door against her cheek as she slid to the ground, her body finally surrendering to the cold and the hunger and the endless crushing weight of her flight. Awareness returned in fragments, the feeling of being lifted. The sheer impossible strength of the arms that held her. She was a small woman, but she felt weightless. There was a smell of pine and leather and cold mountain air. She tried to open her eyes, but her lids were heavy as stones. She heard a grunt, a low, guttural sound, but no words. Then she was on a surface that was soft, a bed of furs that smelled of cedar and dust. Something heavy, a thick wool blanket, was laid over her. She tried to speak, to ask about Leo, but only a dry rasp came out. Panic flared in her chest, hot and sharp. "The baby," she croaked, the words tearing at her raw throat. She forced her eyes open. The man was a silhouette against the firelight. He was huge, a mountain of a man with a wild beard that covered most of his face and hair that fell to his shoulders. He filled the small cabin with his presence. He was watching her, his eyes dark and unreadable in the flickering light. He didn't speak. He simply turned, and she saw Leo, wrapped in a small piece of deerskin, sleeping in a wooden crate near the hearth. He was safe. The relief was so profound it felt like a physical blow, and she fell back into the darkness. When she woke again, the light in the cabin was gray and thin. Dawn. The fire was banked, a bed of glowing orange coals. The man was gone. On a small three-legged stool beside her cot was a wooden bowl of what looked like stew and a tin cup of water. Her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing noise in the stillness. She sat up slowly, her body aching with a deep, settled soreness. The blanket was coarse but wonderfully warm. She drank the water first, letting it soothe the fire in her throat. It was cold and clean, tasting of stone and snowmelt. Then she ate the stew. It was rabbit, she thought, with wild onions and some kind of root vegetable. It was simple, unseasoned, but it was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She ate until the bowl was empty, then looked over at Leo. He was still sleeping, his little chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. The man had taken care of him. He had taken care of her. She looked around the cabin. It was one room, meticulously spare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Her cot was in one corner, a larger one, presumably his, in another. A rough-hewn table and two stools stood in the center. Shelves held a few tin plates, some jars, and neatly folded hides. There were tools she didn't recognize, and a long rifle mounted over the hearth. Everything was clean, ordered, purposeful. It was the home of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. The door opened, and he entered, carrying an armload of firewood. He moved with a surprising quietness for a man his size. He didn't look at her, just went to the fireplace and began methodically stacking the wood. He was wearing buckskins and heavy boots. He moved like the mountains looked, solid, ancient, and immovable. Theda cleared her throat. "Thank you," she said, her voice still rough. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn. He gave no sign he had heard her at all, other than a fractional pause in the placement of a log. He finished his task, then straightened and went to the table. He picked up a knife and a piece of wood and began to carve, his large hands moving with an unnerving delicacy. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scrape of the knife against the wood and the soft sigh of the wind outside. It wasn't an empty silence. It was heavy, weighted with years of disuse. The man from the settlement had been right. He didn't speak. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun. Theda learned the rhythm of his silence. His name, she decided, was Silas, as the man had said, though he never confirmed it. He would leave for hours at a time, returning with a rabbit or a brace of grouse slung over his shoulder. He never acknowledged her presence with a look or a word, but there was always food left for her, always wood for the fire. He was a ghost in his own home, a large, quiet presence that provided for her needs without ever admitting she existed. She, in turn, tried to make herself useful. She swept the floor with a broom made of twigs. She washed their bowls in the creek, the icy water making her hands ache. She mended a tear in his shirt with a needle and thread from her small bundle, leaving it folded on his cot. He wore it the next day, the neat line of her stitches a silent conversation between them. She did not know his name, and he did not know hers. They were two strangers bound by circumstance, and a silence as vast as the mountains around them. Leo was her world. She spent her hours nursing him, singing him soft, wordless lullabies, watching the way his eyes followed the dance of the firelight. But one evening, he felt too warm. By morning, he was burning with fever. His skin was hot and dry to the touch, and his cries were weak and pitiful. A raw, primal fear seized Theta. There was no doctor here, no one to turn to. There was only the silent man and the wilderness. She rocked Leo, her own body trembling. Silas was watching her. She could feel his gaze from across the room where he was sharpening his skinning knife. For the first time, his silence felt not like a refuge, but a threat. A wall she couldn't break through. She had to do something. Back home, her grandmother had been an herb woman. Theta had paid little attention to the lessons, the names of plants and their uses, but now she strained to remember. Feverfew for the heat, willow bark for the pain, yarrow to make the body sweat. She wrapped Leo tightly and placed him back in his crate near the fire. She stood up, her heart pounding. She had to go outside to look for the plants. She walked to the door, her hands shaking as she pulled the leather latch. She expected him to stop her, to block her way, to finally react. He did not move. He just sat there, the whetstone making a soft, rhythmic shushing sound against the steel of his knife. He watched her go, his face a mask of indifference. The air was sharp and cold. Theta scanned the edges of the clearing, her eyes darting from plant to plant, desperately trying to recall her grandmother's words. It was late in the season. Most things were brown and withered. Panic began to rise again, hot and choking. Then she saw it. A cluster of feathery leaves she recognized, growing in the shelter of a large boulder. Yarrow. Relief washed over her, so potent it made her dizzy. She gathered a handful, her fingers clumsy with cold and haste. She found a stand of willow down by the creek and stripped bits of the inner bark with her fingernails. It wasn't much, but it was something. When she returned to the cabin, Silas was standing over Leo's crate. He had a wet rag in his hand and was gently dabbing the baby's forehead. The gesture was so unexpected, so tender, it stopped her in her tracks. He looked up as she came in, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, startling moment. There was something in them beyond indifference. Worry. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, his face settling back into its stony stillness. He stepped away from the crate and returned to his seat by the fire as if nothing had happened. Theta worked quickly. She crushed the herbs and steeped them in hot water from the kettle over the fire. The cabin filled with a bitter, green smell. She let the tea cool, then dipped a corner of a clean rag into it and squeezed a few drops into Leo's mouth. He whimpered but swallowed. She did it again and again, a patient, desperate ritual. She made a poultice from the mashed leaves and laid it on his tiny chest. All the while, Silas watched. He did not help, but he did not interfere. He just watched, his hands still, his silence a heavy blanket over the room. For 2 days, the fever raged. Theta did not sleep. She coaxed the willow bark tea into Leo, bathed him with cool water, and prayed to a god she wasn't sure was listening anymore. She felt Silas's presence behind her, a constant, silent vigil. On the 3rd morning, she woke with a start from a brief, fitful doze in her chair. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. The baby wasn't crying. A cold dread washed over her. She scrambled to the crate, her hands fumbling. She touched Leo's forehead. It was cool, damp with sweat. His eyes were open and he was looking at her, his gaze clear and calm. The fever had broken. A sob escaped her, a ragged, tearing sound. She lifted him from the crate and held him close, burying her face in his neck, breathing in the scent of him, of life. She was weeping freely now, great, shuddering gasps of relief and exhaustion. When she finally looked up, Silas was standing in front of her. He held out a piece of wood. It was the piece he had been carving. He had finished it. It was a bird, a tiny, perfect wren with its head cocked to one side, its feathers intricately detailed. He offered it to her. She looked from the carving to his face. His expression was unchanged, but his eyes held hers. It was an offering, an acknowledgement, a word spoken without sound. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was rough, calloused, but warm. It was the first time they had touched. After the fever, something shifted between them. The silence remained, but its quality changed. It was no longer a wall, but a space they shared. He began to leave things for her not just out of necessity, but as quiet offerings. A strangely shaped stone from the creek, a single eagle feather, a handful of late-season berries left on the table. She, in turn, began to cook their meals, taking the game he brought and making savory stews, baking a dense, heavy bread on the hearthstone. They ate at the same table now, not at the same time, but sharing the same space, the silence between them filled with the small sounds of living. One afternoon, a storm rolled in from the peaks, a violent, sudden squall that turned the sky to bruised purple. Rain lashed against the cabin, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. Theda had been gathering firewood at the edge of the clearing and was soaked through in seconds. She ran back inside, shivering, her teeth chattering. Silas was there, mending a snowshoe. He looked at her, then at the fire, and then back at her. He stood, took the heavy wool blanket from his own cot, and wrapped it around her shoulders without a word. He guided her to the stool nearest the fire, and then went back to his work. Theda sat huddled in the blanket, the rough wool smelling of him, of wood smoke and the clean scent of the mountains. The warmth seeped into her bones, chasing away the chill. She watched him work, his profile lit by the fire. She saw the lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, the hard set of his jaw. He was a man who had been broken by something and had retreated into this wilderness, into this silence, to hold the pieces of himself together. He finished his mending and sat watching the fire, his back to her. Leo was sleeping peacefully in his crate. The storm raged outside, but inside the small cabin, there was a profound sense of peace, of safety. Theda found herself studying the back of his head, the way his dark hair curled over the collar of his buckskin shirt. She wondered what his voice had sounded like before he had locked it away. She wondered what sorrow could be so great as to steal a man's words forever. She fell asleep there, in the chair, wrapped in his blanket, and for the first time since she had started running, she did not dream of being chased. He started carving another toy for Leo, this time a small, clumsy-looking bear. He would work on it in the evenings, the firelight catching the sharp planes of his face. Leo, now healthy and alert, would watch him from his crate, gurgling and kicking his feet. One evening, Silas finished the bear. He sanded it smooth with a piece of sandstone and then held it out. Not to Theda, but to the baby. He knelt by the crate, his large frame looking awkward and out of place so close to the ground. He dangled the bear in front of Leo. The baby's eyes went wide. He reached out a tiny, fat hand and batted at the toy. Silas's stern face cracked. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched the corners of his mouth, a brief flicker of light in the shadows of his beard. He let Leo grasp the bear, his own huge calloused finger dwarfed by the baby's grip. Theda watched, her heart aching with a feeling she couldn't name. It was a strange, painful sort of tenderness. In that moment, he was not a silent mountain man, a ghost in a lonely cabin. He was just a man, captivated by a child. He was beautiful. This fragile piece was shattered a week later. Theda was down at the creek, washing clothes on a flat rock, with Leo sleeping on a blanket nearby. The air was crisp, the sky a clean, sharp blue. She was humming to herself, a half-remembered tune, when she heard the sound of horses. It was wrong. No one came up this high. Silas was out checking his trap lines. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. She scooped Leo into her arms and scrambled back towards the cabin, keeping to the trees. 2 men on horseback were in the clearing. One was a stranger, a hard-faced man with a gun on his hip. The other she knew. Mr. Harding, her husband. He looked out of place in the wilderness, his town clothes already dusty, his face slick with sweat and irritation. But his eyes were the same, possessive, cruel. They swept the clearing, hungry and impatient. "I know she's here," Harding said, his voice a familiar, grating sound that made Theda's blood run cold. "The old fool in town said she came this way, looking for the mute." He dismounted, his boots sinking into the soft earth. "Theda!" he bellowed. His voice was a violation of the mountain's quiet. "I know you're in there, you ungrateful witch. Come out here with my son." Theda flattened herself behind a thick pine, her body trembling. Leo started to fuss, and she pressed his face against her shoulder, murmuring soft, hushing sounds, her own heart hammering against his back. Harding walked to the cabin door and threw it open, peering into the darkness. "Empty," he spat. "She's out here somewhere. Find her." The other man dismounted and began to circle the clearing. Theda knew she was trapped. She could not outrun them, not with the baby. Her mind raced. She could see Harding's face, contorted with rage. He had tracked her. All those miles, all this way. He would never let her go. He saw her and Leo as his property, no different from his horse or his house. The hired man was getting closer to her hiding spot. She had to do something. She looked at Leo's face, his innocent, trusting eyes. She would not let Harding lay a hand on him, never again. Just as the man was about to round the tree, she heard another sound, the soft tread of moccasins on pine needles. Silas. He had come back. He stepped into the clearing from the opposite side, moving with the silence of a predator. He held his rifle loosely in one hand. He wasn't aiming it, just holding it. His face was like stone. He stopped and simply stood there, a silent, immovable object. Harding spun around. "Well, well," he sneered, "the mountain freak himself. I've come for my wife and son. You hand them over and I won't have to burn this pigsty to the ground." Silas didn't move. He didn't speak. He just watched Harding, his eyes flat and cold. "What's the matter? Cat got your tongue?" Harding laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Can't even speak to defend your whore? She came running to you, did she? I'll bet she did. Always had a taste for animals." He took a step toward Silas, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. The hired man had his gun drawn now, pointed at Silas's chest. Theda knew what was going to happen. There would be violence, bloodshed, and it would be her fault. She had brought this danger to his door, to his quiet world. She couldn't let him be harmed for her sake. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out from behind the tree. "Stop," she said. Her voice was shaking, but it was clear. Harding's head snapped toward her, a triumphant, ugly smile spreading across his face. "There she is." "I'll go with you," Theda said, looking directly at Harding, refusing to look at Silas. "Just don't hurt him. He has nothing to do with this." "Of course he doesn't," Harding said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "He's just a dumb beast who gave you shelter. Now come here." He beckoned with his hand. Theda took a step, then another. Each one felt like she was walking on broken glass. She could feel Silas's eyes on her, feel his stillness. She risked a glance at him. His face was a mask of cold fury, but underneath it, in his eyes, she saw something else. Something that looked like betrayal, like a wound. She was choosing to leave, to go back to the man who had hurt her. He thought she was abandoning him, abandoning their fragile, silent world. The pain of it was so sharp she almost cried out. But this was the only way to keep him safe. She reached Harding, who grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh like claws. "Give me the boy," he commanded. She clutched Leo tighter. "No," she whispered. His hand cracked across her face, the force of it snapping her head to the side. Her cheek stung, and the world went white for a second. "I said give him to me." From the corner of her eye, she saw Silas take a step forward. The hired man's gun barrel followed him. "Don't be a fool, mountain man," the man warned. "It ain't your fight." Theda looked at Silas, her eyes pleading with him. "Don't. Let me go. It's the only way." He stopped. His face was terrible to look at. It was the face of a man watching his world burn down for a second time. He was trapped by his silence, by their guns. He could do nothing. Harding wrenched Leo from her arms. The baby, startled and afraid, began to wail. "There now," Harding cooed, his voice sickeningly sweet. "Let's go home." He started to pull Theda toward his horse. She stumbled after him, a prisoner once more. She looked back one last time. Silas was still standing there, a statue carved from grief and rage, watching them go. The silence he had cultivated as a shield had become his cage. The clearing grew smaller, the cabin disappearing behind the trees. The last thing she saw was his solitary figure, swallowed by the wilderness he had chosen, and now by the silence she had left him to. The journey down the mountain was a nightmare. Harding kept a brutal grip on her arm, his knuckles white. He held Leo in his other arm, awkwardly, as if the baby were a sack of flour. Leo cried inconsolably, his small face red and blotchy. The sound grated on Harding's nerves. "Be quiet, you little brat," he snarled, giving the baby a rough shake. Theda cried out, lunging for him, but Harding shoved her back. "You'll learn your place again soon enough," he said. The hired man rode behind them, his rifle held across his saddle. Theda's mind was a maelstrom of fear and despair. She had made a terrible mistake. She had thought she was saving Silas, but she had only condemned herself and her son. The man she had left on the mountain was more of a protector, more of a father, in his silence than Harding would ever be with all his words. The silence of the cabin had been a warm blanket. The world of men was cold and loud and violent. As they reached a narrow part of the trail, a rocky outcrop overlooking a steep ravine, Theda knew she had to act. She couldn't go back. She wouldn't. She looked at the terrain, her mind racing, recalling the path Silas had taken, the way the land fell away. She stumbled intentionally, letting her full weight sag against Harding. He cursed, trying to hold her up, control the horse, and manage the crying baby all at once. In that moment of imbalance, she drove her elbow back, hard into his ribs. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. She twisted away from him, grabbing for Leo. She managed to get her hands on the baby's blanket, yanking him from Harding's clumsy hold. She scrambled backward, off the trail, into the dense underbrush. "Get her!" Harding roared at the hired man. Theda didn't wait. She plunged into the forest, thorns and branches tearing at her dress and skin. She could hear them crashing through the woods behind her, Harding shouting curses. She ran, her lungs burning, her only thought to put distance between them. She knew these woods better now. She knew the game trails, the thickets that offered the best cover. She was no longer a lost woman from the flatlands. The mountain had taught her things. She half ran, half fell down a steep embankment, landing in the cold, rushing water of the creek. The shock of it took her breath, but she held Leo's head up high. She waded downstream, the icy water numbing her legs, knowing it would hide her tracks. She could still hear them, farther away now, shouting in frustration. She found a hollow under an ancient, overturned fir tree, its roots forming a dark, earthen cave. She crawled inside, pulling Leo close, trying to quiet both his shivering and her own. They lay there in the cold and the dark, listening to the sounds of the hunt fade into the distance. She didn't know how long she waited. An hour. Maybe 2. The cold was seeping deep into her bones. Leo was quiet, his small body trembling against hers. She was about to risk moving when she heard a sound that made her freeze. Not the heavy tread of Harding's boots, but a soft, deliberate footfall. The sound of a man who belonged in these woods. She held her breath. A figure appeared at the opening of her hiding place, silhouetted against the gray light. It was Silas. He was alone. His rifle was gone. His hands were empty. He looked down at her, his face grim. And then he did the thing she never thought he would do. He spoke. "Theta." His voice was a revelation. It was low and rough, cracked with disuse, like stones grinding together. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. Hearing him say her name, a name she hadn't told him, a name Harding had shouted for all the woods to hear, undid her. A sob broke from her lips. He knelt, reaching a hand out to her. "They're gone," he rasped, his voice gaining a little more strength. "I sent them on their way." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. She saw the fresh cut on his cheek and the raw, scraped skin on his knuckles. He had not stood by. He had followed. He had fought for her. He helped her out of the hollow, his grip on her arm strong and steady. He took off his thick buckskin shirt and wrapped it around her and the shivering baby, leaving himself in just a thin linen undershirt. He scooped Leo into his arms, holding him with a gentleness that belied his strength. "Come," he said, the single word a command and a promise. "Let's go home." The walk back to the cabin was made in a new kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, but the silence of anticipation. The world felt different now that she knew he had a voice. When they arrived, he built up the fire until it was roaring, a great crackling beast that filled the small room with warmth and dancing light. He took Leo from her, unwrapped him from the wet blankets, and dried him with a soft piece of hide, his large hands impossibly gentle. Theta changed into her only other dress, a faded calico, her body still trembling with cold and adrenaline. When she came back to the hearth, he was sitting on one of the stools, rocking Leo in his arms. The baby was asleep, his face peaceful. Silas looked up at her, and his eyes were full of things he didn't know how to say. "My name," he said, his voice still a gravelly rumble, "is Reno." She sat on the other stool, facing him across the warm space of the hearth. "I'm Theta," she whispered. Though he already knew, he nodded slowly. "I know." He looked down at the sleeping baby in his arms. "My wife, my Sarah, she died, birthing our son." His voice caught on the words, rusty with old pain. "He was so small. The fever took him before the first snow. I couldn't save them." The words stopped. There was nothing left to say. He fell silent, the firelight catching the glint of moisture in his eyes. So this was his damage. A grief so profound it had stolen his voice, driven him into the wilderness to escape a world that was full of memories and loss. He had closed himself off, walled himself in with silence, because the pain of speaking, of remembering, was too great. "I'm sorry," Theta said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "He looked like him," Reno said, his gaze fixed on Leo. "Your boy. When you brought him here, it was like seeing a ghost." He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with a decade of unshed tears. "I was afraid. When that man took you, I thought I was losing them all over again." This was the mutual rescue. She had come to his mountain fleeing a monster and had accidentally woken a man from a long, silent sleep. She had brought life back into his dead world, and he, in turn, had stood against the darkness that had chased her. She had saved him from his grief, and he had saved her from her past. "He won't be back," Reno said, his voice hard now. "I made that clear." Thada believed him. She reached out and placed her hand on his arm. His muscles were tense beneath her touch. "Thank you, Reno." He covered her hand with his own. His palm was warm and rough, engulfing her small hand completely. "You showed up with a baby and no name," he said softly, his voice finding a smoother rhythm. "You brought the world back to my door. I should be thanking you." They sat there for a long time as the fire burned down to embers, his hand covering hers, the sleeping baby breathing softly in his arms. The storm outside was over, and the storm inside them was finally beginning to quiet. The silence that settled over the cabin was not empty or lonely. It was full. It was the comfortable, peaceful quiet of two broken people who had found a way to be whole together. It was the sound of home. In the weeks that followed, the cabin changed. Reno's voice, once a stranger in the small space, became a part of its fabric. He didn't speak often, and when he did, his words were spare and chosen with care, as if he were still learning their weight. He would name the trees for her as they walked, his voice a low rumble. "That's a lodgepole pine, that one's a fir." He taught her how to read the clouds, to know when a storm was coming. He spoke of the seasons on the mountain, of the habits of the deer and the elk. He was unlocking his world for her, one quiet word at a time. Theda, in turn, filled the silence with life. She sang to Leo, her voice soft and clear. She talked to him as she worked, her chatter a bright counterpoint to Reno's thoughtful quiet. She found a patch of wild mint and brewed tea, the fresh scent chasing the last of the dusty memories from the corners of the cabin. She was no longer a woman with no name, a fugitive hiding from the world. She was Theda. And this mountain, this small cabin, was her home. One crisp autumn evening, Reno came in from checking his snares, a fat rabbit in one hand and something else in the other. He handed her the rabbit and then, with a shy, almost boyish hesitation, he held out his other hand. In his palm lay a small, lopsided circlet of woven willow, with the bright, stubborn blue of a late-blooming mountain flower tucked into the weave. It wasn't a ring. It was something more. It was a promise made in the language of the wilderness. It was a crown for the queen of his small, silent kingdom. She took it, her fingers tracing the delicate weave. She looked up at him, her heart too full for words. He reached out and gently tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, his calloused thumb brushing her cheek. "You belong here," he said, his voice soft but sure. It was not a question, it was a statement of fact. And in the warm glow of the firelight, with her baby sleeping soundly and the wild, silent man standing before her, she knew it was true. The world had discarded her, left her for dead, but here, on this lonely mountain, she had been found. Here, she was home. We all face our own wilderness, a place where it feels like we are lost and alone, running from a past that threatens to consume us. But as Theda learned, sometimes the deepest wilderness is where we find our truest shelter, and the most broken souls are the ones with the most love to give. If you've ever found strength you didn't know you had, or been saved by a kindness you never expected, please give this story a like and subscribe to our channel for more tales of love and survival on the frontier. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new story. We have to ask, have you ever had to trust a stranger when you had no one else to turn to? Let us know in the comments below. We believe that even in the harshest country, the heart can always find its way home.